Those explosions you see in war movies? Some of them were not special effects. What if the blast that shook the screen also shook the actors standing a few feet away? What if the fireballs tearing through the battlefield were triggered by real demolition crews, not computers? In several war films, directors refused to fake the destruction. They buried charges in the ground, detonated real artillery blasts, and filmed actors running through genuine shockwaves. And one of these productions came terrifyingly close to disaster. Das Boot, 1981. Submarine warfare rarely looks explosive on screen. Most of the danger happens underwater, hidden from sight. Yet during the production of Das Boot, the filmmakers refused to rely on harmless studio tricks to simulate the terror of naval combat. Instead, they recreated depth-charge attacks using powerful practical detonations placed beneath massive water tanks and outdoor ocean rigs. When the explosions went off, the shockwaves traveled through the water exactly the way they would during a real attack. Inside the submarine set, the crew violently shook the entire structure while debris, water, and equipment rained down on the actors. The effect was terrifyingly real. Cameras captured the panic as the submarine groaned and shuddered under simulated pressure. Director Wolfgang Petersen wanted audiences to feel the claustrophobic dread sailors experienced during World War II. Real explosive force helped create that illusion. The result was a submarine film that felt less like fiction and more like surviving a naval disaster. Kelly's Heroes, 1970. At first glance, Kelly's Heroes looks like a playful war adventure, but behind the humor was a production that relied heavily on real demolition work. The climactic sequence required an entire French village set to be partially destroyed during a tank assault. Rather than using miniature models, the filmmakers planted practical explosive charges throughout the buildings and streets. When the cameras rolled, those charges were triggered as real military vehicles advanced through the town. Windows shattered, walls collapsed, and dust clouds erupted across the battlefield. Actors ran through the destruction while tanks fired blanks powerful enough to produce convincing muzzle blasts. The explosions were carefully controlled, but the physical force on set was unmistakable. Director Brian G. Hutton believed the destruction needed to look authentic for the story to work. If the explosions looked fake, the entire illusion of combat would collapse. So when buildings crumble during the film's final battle, they are not visual tricks. They are real structures being blown apart for the camera. Midway, 1976. Before digital effects transformed Hollywood, recreating naval warfare meant building explosions the hard way. Midway attempted to capture one of the most important battles of World War II, and the filmmakers knew audiences expected large-scale destruction. To achieve that scale, the production used real pyrotechnics across enormous miniature aircraft carriers and battlefield sets. These were not tiny model kits placed on a table. Some of the ships measured several meters long and were detailed with working gun turrets, aircraft decks, and structural components designed to break apart under explosive force. When the detonations were triggered, massive fireballs erupted across the decks while pieces of the ships tore apart exactly the way real vessels might under attack. Filming those blasts required careful timing and dozens of technicians coordinating the explosions. Once triggered, the models could never be used again. Everything happened in a single take. The result was spectacular destruction captured entirely in camera. Decades later, many of those sequences still look convincing precisely because the explosions were real physical events rather than computer-generated effects. The Thin Red Line, 1998. Terrence Malick's The Thin Red Line is often remembered for its philosophical tone and haunting narration. But behind its quiet storytelling lies an extraordinary commitment to practical battlefield realism. The production recreated brutal combat in the jungles of Guadalcanal using carefully placed explosive charges buried beneath the tall grass and muddy terrain. When the charges detonated, they hurled dirt, smoke, and debris high into the air. Soldiers ran through the chaos while explosions erupted only meters away. Because these blasts were real pyrotechnic events, the actors had to follow precise timing cues to avoid the most dangerous parts of the explosions. One wrong step could place someone directly in the path of flying debris. The filmmakers wanted viewers to feel the randomness of combat. The way artillery suddenly erupts without warning. Instead of stylized action sequences, the explosions appear chaotic and unpredictable. Dirt flies across the frame, shockwaves ripple through the vegetation, and the battlefield feels frighteningly alive. That authenticity gives the film its unsettling atmosphere. It does not feel like a staged battle. It feels like soldiers trapped inside a real artillery bombardment. Platoon, 1986. When Oliver Stone set out to make Platoon, he had one goal above all else: authenticity. Stone had served in the Vietnam War himself, and he believed Hollywood war movies often sanitized combat. To capture the brutal unpredictability of jungle warfare, he insisted on practical explosions instead of harmless visual tricks. The production team buried explosive charges throughout the Philippine jungle locations used for filming. These charges simulated mortar strikes, grenades, and artillery impacts. Once triggered, the blast threw dirt and debris across the battlefield exactly the way real explosions would. Actors moving through the jungle had to memorize their positions carefully because detonations were scheduled to erupt just seconds after they passed certain markers. The effect was intense. During filming, performers sometimes felt the heat and shockwaves of nearby blasts. Stone wanted viewers to experience the chaos of combat, not a polished action sequence. The explosions arrived suddenly, scattering soldiers and filling the air with smoke and flying soil. Those moments helped define the film's realism. Platoon did not just show the Vietnam War. It recreated the terrifying feeling of being inside it. We Were Soldiers, 2002. The Battle of Ia Drang was one of the most ferocious confrontations of the Vietnam War, and the filmmakers behind We Were Soldiers wanted the chaos of that battlefield to feel authentic. Rather than relying heavily on computer effects, the production used large practical pyrotechnic charges hidden throughout the terrain. Each explosion simulated incoming artillery shells and rocket impacts. Dirt erupted from the ground, trees splintered apart, and smoke rolled across the valley as soldiers scrambled for cover. Actors had to run through this environment while explosions detonated around them according to a precise sequence controlled by pyrotechnics crews. Because the blasts were real, your cameras captured natural shockwaves and debris that digital effects often struggle to replicate. The intensity helped recreate the overwhelming sensory chaos described by veterans of the battle. Director Randall Wallace believed those explosions were essential to honoring the reality of the conflict. War, he argued, should never feel clean or controlled. In We Were Soldiers, the battlefield looks violent and unpredictable, because during filming, it actually was. Letters from Iwo Jima, 2006. Clint Eastwood's Letters from Iwo Jima approached World War II from the Japanese perspective, telling the story of soldiers defending the island against overwhelming American assault. To capture the violence of the invasion, the production relied heavily on practical explosions buried beneath the volcanic terrain used to recreate the island. When the charges detonated, they blasted black sand and ash into the air, creating towering plumes that mirrored historical photographs of the real battle. Actors moved through trenches and tunnels while explosions erupted across the battlefield, forcing them to react to genuine shockwaves and falling debris. The realism gave the combat scenes a haunting intensity. Unlike stylized war films filled with heroic music and dramatic slow motion, these battles feel chaotic and frightening. The explosions arrive suddenly, scattering soldiers and filling the air with choking smoke. Eastwood wanted viewers to experience the terror of being trapped on a collapsing battlefield with nowhere left to retreat. Her practical explosions helped achieve that effect. Each blast reminds the audience that the soldiers on screen are not simply characters in a film. They are men caught in the final moments of a desperate defense. Black Hawk Down, 2001. When Ridley Scott began production on Black Hawk Down, he faced a difficult challenge. The Battle of Mogadishu was chaotic urban warfare filled with helicopter crashes, rocket strikes, and relentless explosions. Recreating that environment without artificial-looking effects would be extremely difficult. Scott decided the only way to capture the chaos was to stage real explosive events across the streets of the Moroccan city used as the film's location. Pyrotechnics teams placed hundreds of charges inside buildings, vehicles, and road surfaces. When triggered, the blasts sent concrete fragments in dust clouds and shattered debris flying through the air. Actors ran through narrow alleyways while explosions erupted only seconds behind them. The production also staged massive vehicle explosions to simulate rocket attacks on military convoys. These detonations created towering fireballs that cameras captured from multiple angles. One of the most dangerous sequences involved a helicopter crash simulation. Explosive charges ripped apart vehicles and buildings as soldiers rushed toward the wreckage. The filmmakers wanted viewers to feel the disorienting chaos of urban combat. Nothing appears polished or choreographed. Gunfire echoes through collapsing structures while explosions erupt unpredictably across the battlefield, because many of those blasts were real. The result is one of the most intense urban warfare sequences ever captured on film. The Hurt Locker, 2008. Few war films focus on explosions as intensely as The Hurt Locker. The entire story revolves around soldiers whose job is to disarm bombs before they detonate. Ironically, many of the explosions shown in the film were very real. Director Catherine Bigelow worked with explosive specialists to stage actual detonations in the Jordanian desert where the film was shot. Instead of relying on computer effects, the team used high-powered pyrotechnic charges designed to produce authentic blast patterns. These explosions were filmed with extremely high-speed cameras capable of capturing thousands of frames per second. When played back in slow motion, the footage revealed shockwaves rippling through the air as debris and dust blasted outward from the center of the explosion. The visuals were mesmerizing and terrifying at the same time. Pieces of concrete and metal fragments spun through the air while massive clouds of dust rolled across the landscape like tidal waves. Because the blasts were genuine detonations, the physics looked completely natural. The explosions behaved the way real bombs behave. Actors standing nearby could feel the force of the blasts as the shockwaves passed through the filming area. Bigelow wanted audiences to experience the terrifying power of explosives, the sudden violence, the expanding pressure wave, the deadly unpredictability. Instead of stylized fireballs, the film shows explosions as chaotic physical events, which is exactly what they are. Fury, 2014. Tank warfare is loud, violent, and brutally destructive. When director David Ayer began filming Fury, he wanted every battle to reflect that harsh reality. Rather than building the movie around digital explosions, the production used practical explosive charges scattered throughout the battlefield sets. These detonations simulated artillery strikes landing near the advancing tanks. When triggered, the blasts hurled soil, smoke, and burning debris across the landscape while armored vehicles pushed forward through the chaos. The filmmakers also used real World War II military vehicles whenever possible, including an operational German Tiger tank. To simulate tank shells striking buildings and enemy positions, explosive squibs were placed inside structures and trenches. When the tanks fired, the charges detonated in perfect synchronization with the muzzle blasts. The result looked frighteningly real. Entire walls collapsed, dirt exploded into the air, and burning wreckage filled the battlefield. Actors inside the tanks described the filming process as extremely intense. The sound of explosions outside the metal hulls was deafening, and the shock waves rattled the vehicles violently. Ayer believed that authenticity mattered. War should not look clean or safe. It should look chaotic, dangerous, and terrifying. The practical explosions in Fury helped achieve that goal. Instead of a polished action spectacle, the film delivers something closer to the brutal reality of armored warfare. A Bridge Too Far, 1977. In the 1970s, our war epics often attempted something modern productions rarely attempt today: scale. A Bridge Too Far recreated Operation Market Garden, one of the largest airborne operations of World War II. The filmmakers assembled thousands of extras, dozens of military vehicles, and massive battlefield sets across the Netherlands. To recreate the violence of the campaign, the production relied heavily on real demolition work. Explosive teams planted charges beneath bridges, inside buildings, and across open terrain to simulate artillery bombardments and structural destruction. When the cameras rolled, those charges detonated in carefully timed sequences as soldiers advanced across the battlefield. The explosions were enormous. Bridges erupted in clouds of smoke. Buildings collapsed as debris scattered across the streets. Entire sections of battlefield terrain appeared to erupt under artillery fire. Actors moved through this chaos while explosions detonated around them, creating an atmosphere that felt disturbingly close to real combat. Because digital effects did not exist at the time, every blast had to be staged physically. That meant each explosion could only be filmed once. If the timing failed or a camera missed the moment, the entire set might already be destroyed. The pressure on the crew was immense, yet the results were spectacular. The film captured large-scale battlefield destruction that still looks convincing decades later. When explosions tear through the bridges and streets of A Bridge Too Far, the destruction is not simulated. Entire structures were genuinely demolished for the camera. Tora, 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 1970. Few war films attempted the scale of destruction seen in Tora, Tora, Tora. The film recreates the Japanese attack on Pearl Harbor, a moment that involved dozens of aircraft, naval vessels, and massive explosions across the harbor. To achieve realism, the filmmakers refused to rely solely on miniature effects. Instead, they constructed large-scale replicas of American battleships and military installations. These sets were wired with extensive demolition charges designed to replicate bombs striking the ships. When the cameras rolled, those charges detonated simultaneously, producing enormous fireballs that engulfed the vessels. Water erupted into the air as explosive blasts tore through the harbor. The pyrotechnic work was so massive that some explosions were visible from miles away during filming. The aircraft flew overhead while explosions ripped through the ships below, creating one of the most convincing recreations of Pearl Harbor ever filmed. Because these blasts were real, the destruction had a physical weight that digital effects often struggle to replicate. Fire spreads naturally, smoke drifts unpredictably. Debris falls exactly the way gravity demands. Every element of the explosion behaves like a real disaster. The production required extraordinary coordination between stunt crews, pilots, demolition experts, and camera teams. When the explosions finally erupted on screen, they captured the terrifying scale of the attack. Even decades later, those scenes remain among the most impressive practical effects ever staged in a war film. Dunkirk, 2017. When Christopher Nolan began making Dunkirk, he made a decision that immediately shaped the entire production. He would not rely on computer-generated explosions. Modern war films often create destruction digitally, layering visual effects onto the screen after filming. Nolan rejected that approach almost entirely. Instead, he insisted that the evacuation of Dunkirk should be recreated with real physical blasts on real locations. The beaches used during filming were rigged with buried explosive charges designed to simulate artillery strikes landing among the evacuating soldiers. When those detonations were triggered, enormous columns of sand and smoke erupted into the air while actors scattered across the beach. Because the explosions were real, the reactions captured on camera were genuine. Soldiers dove for cover as shockwaves rolled across the sand, and debris rained down around them. The environment looked unpredictable and chaotic because it actually was. The production also staged explosive attacks on real ships floating in open water. Charges were placed inside the vessels so that when detonated, they would rip apart sections of the decks, sending splinters and smoke skyward. These explosions were filmed using IMAX cameras, capturing every detail of the destruction in extraordinary clarity. Nolan believed that practical explosions behave in ways digital effects cannot fully replicate. Fire spreads unpredictably, smoke moves naturally with the wind. Shockwaves ripple across the environment. Those physical details help the audience believe what they are seeing. When bombs explode in Dunkirk, they do not feel like visual effects added after the fact. They feel like real ordnance tearing apart a battlefield. Because in many cases, that is exactly what the filmmakers created. Come and See, 1985. Few war films have ever pursued realism as ruthlessly as Come and See. Directed by Soviet filmmaker Elim Klimov, the film tells the story of a young Belarusian boy witnessing the Nazi destruction of his village during World War II. From the beginning, Klimov insisted that the film should not feel like a traditional war movie. It should feel like a nightmare unfolding in real time. To achieve that effect, the production used real explosions and live ammunition during several sequences. Actors moved through forests and villages while demolition charges detonated around them, sending dirt, splinters, and smoke bursting into the air. In some scenes, their machine guns firing real rounds were used to strike objects positioned dangerously close to the actors. The filmmakers carefully calculated where those bullets would land, but the margin for error remained frighteningly small. The young lead actor, Alexei Kravchenko, was often placed in environments where explosions erupted nearby while buildings burned around him. The result is a film that feels disturbingly authentic. Explosions do not look choreographed or cinematic. They erupt suddenly, violently, and without warning. Smoke fills the frame. Debris scatters through the air. Characters react with genuine fear because the danger surrounding them feels real. Klimov believed the horrors of war should never be sanitized for audiences. Instead of stylized heroism, come and see Presence War as something chaotic, terrifying, and emotionally devastating. The explosions in the film contribute heavily to that atmosphere. They do not resemble movie spectacle. They resemble destruction. Even decades after its release, many viewers find the film difficult to watch because its realism feels so overwhelming. It is not simply depicting war, it feels like surviving it. Saving Private Ryan, 1998. Few war films have reshaped the way combat is portrayed on screen as dramatically as Saving Private Ryan. When director Steven Spielberg began planning the recreation of the Normandy landings, he knew the opening assault on Omaha Beach would define the entire film. If the battle felt staged or artificial, the illusion of history would collapse. To avoid that, the production designed one of the most complex practical effects setups ever attempted in a war movie. Hundreds of explosive charges were buried beneath the sand across the beach location. These charges were carefully arranged to simulate artillery shells slamming into the ground as soldiers advanced toward the shoreline. When detonated, the blast hurled towering columns of sand, water, and debris into the air. Actors sprinted across the beach while explosions erupted only a short distance away. The timing had to be exact. Performers ran past marked points seconds before explosive charges detonated behind them. This allowed the cameras to capture soldiers diving for cover as the battlefield suddenly erupted around them. The realism was startling. Sand sprayed across the screen, water exploded upward where bullets struck the surf, and in thick smoke rolled across the beach as troops struggled forward under relentless fire. To enhance the chaos, explosive squibs were attached to actors' uniforms to simulate bullet impacts during the assault. The combined effect created one of the most intense combat sequences ever filmed. Many veterans of the Normandy invasion later remarked on how accurately the scene captured the confusion and terror of the real landing. The explosions do not feel choreographed. They feel sudden, violent, and terrifyingly unpredictable. That authenticity changed the visual language of war cinema, proving that practical explosions could recreate the raw chaos of battle like nothing else. Apocalypse Now, 1979. Few war films have ever attempted destruction on the scale seen in Apocalypse Now. When director Francis Ford Coppola began filming in the jungles of the Philippines, he was determined to create battle scenes that felt overwhelming and chaotic, not staged or artificial. To achieve that realism, the production worked closely with the Philippine military. Real helicopters were supplied for filming, allowing the crew to stage the now legendary helicopter assault sequence often remembered alongside Wagner's thunderous Ride of the Valkyries. But the aircraft were only part of the spectacle. Demolition teams wired the entire village set with explosive charges designed to simulate bombs and artillery strikes. When the helicopters swept across the sky, those charges detonated across the landscape. Buildings erupted into flames, fireballs rolled through the huts, and thick smoke poured across the jungle. Because the blasts were real, the shockwaves rippled through the environment. Palm trees bent under the pressure, debris scattered across the ground, and the battlefield looked frighteningly alive. Coordinating these sequences required extraordinary precision. Pilots had to follow exact flight paths while demolition crews triggered explosions beneath them. Cameras captured the chaos from multiple angles while actors ran through the collapsing village. The entire production often resembled a military operation rather than a film set. Coppola believed that portraying the madness of the Vietnam War required overwhelming sensory chaos. Real fire, real explosions, and real destruction unfolding in front of the camera. The result was unforgettable. More than 4 decades later, the helicopter assault sequence remains one of the most spectacular practical explosion scenes ever filmed, because the destruction audiences see on screen was not created by computers. It was detonated in the jungle for real. War movies often promise realism, but these films push that promise further than most audiences realize. The explosions were not added later. They were detonated on real locations with actors running through the shockwaves. That authenticity created some of the most unforgettable battle scenes ever filmed. And it also reminds us of one truth about war cinema. Sometimes the danger on screen was real.